My name is Tom Beck. I'm Chief Curator, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this program in conjunction with the exhibition, Psychic Projections, Photographic Impressions, Paranormal Photographs from the Jule Eisenbud Collection on Ted Serios. There are several people I'd like to recognize before we get started. And first off, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and Gallery for their support of this exhibition and the program, and for their long-term support of the gallery. In addition, I'd like to say that the presentation of this exhibition is supported by an arts program grant from the Maryland State Arts Council, an agency funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. I'd like to also thank especially Emily Hauver, our interim curator of exhibitions, for all of her outstanding effort in curating this exhibition. Let's have a hand for Emily. She's really done a great job. I'd also like to thank Peggy Ray, Professor of Visual Arts, for her magnificent design, not only of the announcement for the exhibition, but also for the design of the gallery as well. I'd like to say that Dr. Larry Wilt, over the years, has been a strong supporter of the gallery, and we thank him for his many efforts on behalf of the gallery. Today's reception is supported by the Libby Kuhn Endowment. I'm also grateful to Larry and Donna Hauver for all of their effort in helping us as volunteers to make the exhibition possible. Tonight's program is twofold. On the one hand, the program is devoted to the exhibition, but on the other hand, it's a special occasion because it's an opportunity to honor Steve Braude, Professor Stephen Braude, who is chair of the, as you can see on the screen, chair of the philosophy department and a longtime professor at UMBC. Steve is really the reason that we're here tonight. In 2002, he called me on the telephone and asked me if we were interested in having the Jule Eisenbud Collection on Ted Serios and photographic photography. I immediately said yes. I had heard about it. I was a student in school, and he put me in touch with the curator at the Denver Public Library, where Dr. Jule Eisenbud had deposited the archive sometime before the conclusion of his need for the materials. Dr. Eisenbud had passed away in 1999. Steve also put me in touch with Dr. Eric Eisenbud, son of Jule. We assured Eric that we would be delighted to have the archive here and that it would be safe and secure from departing from UMBC as it had from Denver. We're not going to let this one get away from us, that's for sure. So we thank Eric for accepting UMBC as the holder of the collection and for donating additional materials to the UMBC archive, including the original Polaroid camera over in the case in which some of the experimentation was carried out, and you see books from Dr. Jule Eisenbud's library there as well. I'd like to thank our archivist, Lindsay Laper, for processing the Eisenbud Serios collection. She worked in special collections over the years with supervising graduate students and making this material that arrived in about a dozen corrugated cardboard boxes into the archive that we now have and have a finding aid online. This archive has brought the name of UMBC to the attention of many people. Just this week, I got an email from a freelance writer in Norway wanting to write an article about the collection. And we have loaned material from the archive to La Maison Européenne de Photographie in Paris, as well as to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Those occasions carried the name of UMBC to those destinations. So the archive is helping to get the name of UMBC out there. In further tribute to Steve Braude, I present to you the best dean we've ever had, Dr. John Jeffries.
One might suspect the only dean. I'm glad to say a few tonight. Not enough words, I think, but better fewer from me and more from Steve. A few words about my friend and colleague, Steve Braude. This is now Steve's last full semester at UMBC, and he can look back on a remarkably productive and important career, both professional and scholarly, of real achievement and contribution, and not infrequently, contestation. He's been a department chair here for a number of years, and he has most recently done me a particular favor by becoming chair again. I'm sure we can agree, have not been the most propitious, but I'm indebted to him for taking over in these past couple of years. As a scholar, Steve is an authority in particular on parapsychology, and I haven't the time to list all of his accomplishments and honors, but he's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration. He's won numerous awards and fellowships, some of them, like one from the National Endowment for the Humanities, quite prestigious. Author of 5 books, author of some 6 articles. I might go on if I had the full CV in front of me, but I won't. But it's been a distinguished career. I would say that we certainly include among those achievements, as Tom Beck just indicated, Steve's role in bringing the Eisenbud and Serios archive to UMBC. But if that weren't enough, Steve is also a professional musician as both pianist and composer. He's a prize photographer, and a little-known role as a small-time importer of Tokay, a wonderful dessert wine from Hungary, a role that I am especially loath to have Steve leave because of its help for me. I'll also miss Steve's always interesting, often provocative, usually stimulating comments, even when he and I don't entirely agree on what we're saying. But he's been a real force in the university, a scholar of some important accomplishment, and I'm delighted tonight that there's so many people here to hear Steve talk.
That's a tough act to follow. I have no further introduction. I present to you Stephen Braude.
Okay, thank you very much. Everybody hear me? I appreciate all the kind words, John and Tom. You know, I think every time somebody says something nice about me, an angel gets its wings. It's also completely at odds with my own image and my own view. If you asked me, I'd say that beneath this diminutive exterior is an enormous lack of character. I'd also like to commend Tom Beck for having the courage to bring the material here and the open-mindedness to recognize its importance. So I thank you very much. Well, after all the nice remarks about me, it seems only appropriate that I try to say something that will maximize your intellectual discomfort. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about psychokinesis generally, and then explain how the Serios phenomenon fits into it. So, psychokinesis. The abbreviation for it is PK. Very roughly, what it means is mind over matter. If you wanted to give a somewhat more precise definition of it, you could say it's the effect on physical systems by thought alone. Usually people think that the physical systems have to be outside the body, but I don't see any particular reason why that must be the case. So in principle, at least, PK could be thought to embrace various kinds of psychosomatic effects. And basically, there are 2 kinds of PK and evidence for PK. The first is called micro-PK, and this is the sort of evidence that's gathered in typical psychokinetic laboratory experiments. These are conducted under, we'll call them ostensibly controlled conditions. I'll explain why I say that in a minute. success in these experiments is determined quantitatively in terms of deviation from chance, and the effects tend to be small even if they're statistically significant. So you might get 53% scoring when 50% would be expected by chance, but if the number of runs is sufficiently long, the odds against getting even a 53% deviation could be many billions to one. And then there's macro PK, into which category the Serios phenomena fall. And I'd like to call these as either non-experimental or perhaps semi-experimental. They may still be conducted under controlled conditions, but success in these cases is not measured quantitatively, and the effects can be dramatic. So here's what I want to argue for a little bit, and characteristically I'm going to overstate it just a bit. My view is that the best evidence for PK comes from outside the lab. And in fact, I'd argue that the semi or the non-experimental evidence really tells us more about psychic functioning than anything we have learned and probably anything we could learn from typical quantitative laboratory experiments. And that would include evidence from even 19th century cases of physical mediumship. And this goes against the received wisdom, because the received wisdom is that if there was ever going to be convincing evidence for psychokinesis or for any psychic phenomenon, it would have to come from ostensibly controlled laboratory experiments where you can control and manipulate various experimental variables, and hopefully that way you'd be able to obtain clean evidence that would silence the skeptic. I think that is profoundly mistaken, and I'll try to explain why. So there are three major issues that I need to cover to explain why I'm saying this. The first is, since we already have good laboratory evidence, why should we even bother with the looser conditions of a seance or other situations outside a controlled lab? The second is, why should we trust eyewitness reports from outside the lab? And in all these non-experimental or semi-experimental cases, we ultimately have to fall back on eyewitness testimony. The third issue is, isn't the possibility of fraud always a live option? So I'd like to say something about each of these just for a little bit in turn, and then we'll move on to the Serios case. So the first question is, why bother? Why bother with the somewhat looser procedures from spontaneous or semi-experimental cases? In my view, there's a two-part answer to this. First part has to do with what's wrong with quantitative laboratory experiments, in my opinion. And secondly, what's right with less formal forms of evidence, either non-experimental or semi-experimental. So what's wrong with quantitative lab experiments? In my view, the laboratory evidence in parapsychology, good as it is, and I think sometimes it's extremely clever and very ingeniously designed and very tight, the laboratory evidence has two outstanding flaws, and people tend not to pay attention to it, which always mystifies me. First of all, I think it's relatively unconvincing. That is, I don't think it's ever going to convince even open-minded skeptics of the reality of psychic functioning. And secondly, it's inherently unilluminating. That is, even if skeptics were or others were to accept the evidence for psychic functioning, the laboratory evidence won't tell us anything. So I'd like to explain that a little bit. The problem with laboratory evidence is that most experimenters are coming from other areas of science, physics, psychology, biology, and they either overtly or tacitly accept certain questionable assumptions about the nature of science and the value and the appropriateness of experimentation in the behavioral sciences. So they're working in the shadow of J.B. Rhine, who's thought to be the father of modern parapsychology, and in many people's view, it's Rhine who really set the standard for experimentation in parapsychology by following procedures that seem to have worked very well in the behavioral sciences generally, where again, you try to control and manipulate various experimental variables. Unfortunately, it seems to me that Rhine's so-called revolution in parapsychology has been an almost total failure, and ironically, at least to me, it's failed in just those respects in which it was supposed to have succeeded. Because, as a matter of fact, very few people have been convinced, weren't already convinced about the reality of psychic functioning. Very few people have been convinced about psychic functioning just from reading the experimental literature. And part of the problem has to do with the fact that the evidence is all quantitative. And if you ever, well, you probably never will, but if you ever were to read sort of Insider's parapsychology listserv, even parapsychologists debate among themselves what the best statistical methods are for determining whether an experiment has succeeded or failed. There's recently been a real hubbub over an experiment conducted by Cornell psychologist Derek Bem. You might have heard about this. It's being published in a prestigious psychology journal, and it's caused a firestorm of thoroughly predictable responses from people who say the experiments are not well designed, he should be using this kind of statistical technique rather than another one. And these kinds of debates go on forever. And even the meta-analyses that have been done about certain classes of parapsychological experiments are inconclusive as far as the general public is concerned. Because once again, you have to debate whether you should be measuring certain features of an experiment rather than another. Are you measuring the number of trials? Are you measuring the number of bits per trial? So these debates go on forever, and they remain inconclusive. I think another problem is that determining deviations from chance in real-world situations is very, very tricky. It's easy to do on a purely abstract level, but it's very hard to spot them in real-life situations. By contrast, let's say a table floating slowly and gracefully through the air in good light with ample opportunity to investigate it, that poses a kind of clear-cut problem, which you don't get in connection just with laboratory quantitative evidence. So let's just suppose for the moment that skeptics could be convinced about the reality of psychic functioning just from studying the laboratory evidence. I'd still argue that that evidence is not going to tell us anything of interest about psychic functioning, and there are several related reasons. The first is called the source of psi problem, and the problem is this. And I find it remarkable that more people don't take this seriously. If you're studying psychic phenomena, or thinking about it, even as a mere thought experiment, you're considering a kind of phenomenon which, if it exists, could circumvent any experimental controls you could impose. So think about psychokinesis for a minute. It's supposed to be the influence of mind on matter, presumably at a distance. Now, it's not as if we have a PK meter that we can go around and check to see where the force, if it's a force, is coming from. There's no way to know who is responsible for whatever effect you happen to spot in a laboratory situation. As far as, see, actually, most experimenters in parapsychology cling to the view that everybody connected with a parapsychology experiment is going to adhere to a kind of idiotic gentleman's agreement, where only the official subject will use only the psychic ability being tested for, and only when the experimenter's gun goes off, only at the appointed time. And they also assume that nobody else, even remotely connected with the experiment, will use whatever psychic abilities they might have to muddy the experimental waters. So in a PK test, as far as you know, if you get positive results, you can't be sure it's coming from the official subject. For all you know, it could be coming from the experimenter, from the onlooker, from somebody living on a mountaintop in Tibet. There's absolutely no way to tell. And if you get uninteresting results, again, you can't tell whether it's a combination of successful results on the part of the subject and conflicting influence from a skeptical experimenter, for instance. There's no way to know. In ESP experiments, you can't do a double-blind experiment for ESP, right? I mean, the only way you can be blind in an ESP test is blind with respect to normal forms of information acquisition. So there's a serious problem in trying to do officially controlled experiments in parapsychology. And there's another related issue, and this is the problem. I mean, I have a problem with behavioral sciences. I hope I get to offend at least a few psychologists in here. But I think there's a problem in studying anything interesting about human beings when most interesting features of human behavior and most interesting character traits of human beings are all situation sensitive and very context dependent. There was a film the BBC made a number of years ago. It was for their Horizon series. It was shown here as Nova. It was called The Case for ESP. And there was an interview with a skeptical British psychologist, C.E.M. Hansel. And Hansel said, "It should be easy for anyone to tell me to prove that they have telepathy. They just have to tell me what I'm thinking. Now, I think that's a remarkably stupid thing to say, and I really regret that the interviewer didn't say to him, "Is that right, Professor Hansel? Let's see an erection." So if Hansel couldn't produce an erection on the spot, I think he would have resisted the conclusion that he's simply unable to get it up. Right? So, and the fact is, most human abilities, most capacities, most traits are highly situation sensitive. And we have every reason to think the same thing would be true of psychic functioning. And connected with that, I have a problem with the idea that we can actually bring into the lab something, a phenomenon, which if it exists, has a natural history we're completely ignorant of. There are certain features of human behavior and psychological functioning that we can study in the lab, and it's because we already have some idea what they're doing out in the real world. So we can study memory to some extent in laboratory situations. But that's because we have an everyday familiarity with memory. We know how it works in ourselves, more or less. We know how it works in others. We may not have a satisfying theory of memory. In fact, we don't have a theory at all that's worth anything. But we have some idea what memory is. We know what it's naturally. So there's some sense in bringing it into the lab. But we haven't a clue what psychic functioning might be doing out in the world, assuming it exists. And so it seems to me absolutely premature to try to bring it into a laboratory situation. And so when you think about the source of psi problem, I think the only way to get around the source of psi problem is not to test students in psychology classes, unselected subjects. What you need is a superstar subject, somebody who seems to be associated with good results over and over and over in different situations with different experimenters, because even if there's a mess of different influences that lead to the final result, you still have at least a prima facie case for saying this star subject has something to do with the phenomena we're observing. And Ted Serios was that kind of subject. So one other point about all of this. I mean, in my view, to the extent we understand psychic functioning at all, I think there's good reason to suppose it's like a lot of athletic abilities that we can only study in their real-life situations. If you want to study a quarterback's ability to read defenses, a base runner's ability to steal second, a tennis player's ability to return serves, you actually have to observe these things in real-life contests. Some people practice better than they play, some people play better than they practice. But you can't really assess these abilities until they're tested against people who are trying their hardest to win. So the kinds of cases that interest me and that I think are the most fertile in parapsychology all rely on eyewitness testimony. And that raises a whole different and very messy set of issues. And often people say, well, why should we trust eyewitness testimony? My usual response to that is, why shouldn't we in these cases? And what I have found is that when people try to explain why we shouldn't trust the reports of some of the more interesting and outlandish phenomena reported in the parapsychological literature, it seems to me the arguments given are all pretty lame. And one of the main arguments is we could call the argument from human bias. And the idea is that witnesses of parapsychological phenomena are simply biased in favor or predisposed in favor of the miraculous, or biased to see what they want. And so their reports can't be trusted. There are a whole bunch of problems with that. First of all, it won't explain the uniformity of independent observation reports. And you get those, for example, in lots of poltergeist cases. The poltergeist literature goes back hundreds of years, and it goes back to a period before there was any widely disseminated literature on poltergeist that people could read. And one of the interesting things you discover when you read the poltergeist literature is that people quite independently have reported some very, very unusual things which don't seem to be related to any coherent biases at all. Do you know, for example, that in the poltergeist literature, there are lots of independent reports of excrement raining inside of a house? That's pretty odd. No one's come up with a coherent theory of what biases would account for people reporting the raining of excrement in their house. But quite apart from all of that, the appeal to human biases is a double-edged sword. I mean, their biases cut two ways, of course, against they cut against people who are biased in favor of psychic phenomena, and they cut against people whose biases are against psychic phenomena. And interestingly enough, when you read the history of parapsychology, there are all sorts of reports that phenomena didn't occur, but those reports are made by people who were clearly biased against the phenomena. And there are actually some very interesting incidents I can't go into here that show that skeptics in parapsychology have behaved every bit as unreliably and suspiciously as people who might be regarded as lovers of the miraculous. And of course, there are biases in every area of science. So if you're going to reject parapsychological evidence because witnesses were biased in their favor, or the experimenters might be biased in their favor, then you've got to be careful about accepting reports in any area of science. The only completely unbiased scientist, I think, is a dead one. Also, when you really study the literature, one of the things that pops out very clearly is that, as a matter of fact, in the most impressive cases, the witnesses of spontaneous phenomena or the experimenters in some of the strongest cases, these people have not been antecedently biased in favor of the phenomena. Sometimes they've been biased against the phenomena and got good results against their better wishes. And sometimes they've just been neutral with respect to the phenomena. And of course, being open to the paranormal isn't the same thing as being biased in its favor. You can be open to a phenomenon and actually think the probability of the phenomenon's occurring is almost zero. I mean, I'm open to the phenomenon, the possibility that members of alien civilizations have visited Earth, but I actually think that the probability of that having occurred is close to zero, with all due respect to some people here. Also, it's important to recognize that motivated misperception, which is what biased testimony would be, motivated misperception increases under the worst conditions of observation. So I think you have good reasons to trust eyewitness testimony when it's produced under conditions of darkness, total or near darkness, and when the phenomena don't allow for sustained hands-on investigation while they're occurring. But those aren't the best cases. The best cases are the ones where the conditions of observation are impeccable. I'll just mention one other thing in this connection. I imagine some of you know about staged incident experiments in psychology. These are situations where members of a classroom usually are made to witness a carefully prearranged confrontation or dispute, or something that happens very quickly. So this is all arranged in advance, so somebody pulls a gun and then leaves the room, or somebody hits somebody else, and then it's over. And members of the class are polled to explain or to give an account of what happened. And as a matter of fact, many of them get it wrong. Now, does that count against testimony in the best cases of parapsychology? May have to have somebody give this for me. I would say no, and the reason is staged incident cases encourage malobservation. That's the whole point. They encourage misreporting. But the best spontaneous cases are actually conducive to accurate eyewitness testimony for several reasons. First of all, in the best cases, the witnesses are not taken by surprise. In the best cases, the witnesses knew in advance what to look out for, including what kinds of deception might be used to produce the phenomena that are being displayed. Secondly, or thirdly, the lighting will be good in the best cases. And in the best cases, the phenomena linger long enough for sustained and repeated observation and hands-on inspection. So it's not like a sudden blow to the face, which you may not have had a good look at. Again, if a table is floating slowly and gracefully in midair, and you get a chance to look under the table, the lights are good, you can see that nobody's anywhere near the table, you can walk around the table, you set up the thing in advance, that's a different situation. So that brings us to the general problem of fraud. Now, this is actually hard to discuss in general because every case is different, and I don't like to discuss it in general. So I think it's best addressed case by case. And I adopt the following principle. The cases that matter most are the cases most difficult to explain away. One of the things that I find so discouraging about the skeptical literature in parapsychology is that many of the skeptics employ one of the sleaziest argument tactics that every student in critical thinking learns very quickly, and that's the straw man argument, or generalizing from the weakest cases. So very often what you find is that skeptics focus on a particularly unconvincing piece of evidence and then generalize from those, and often never discuss the strongest pieces of evidence. I'm going to discuss now one of the most interesting and bizarre cases from the history of physical mediumship from the 19th century. And it's a perfect example of the kind of case which has never been given the right sort of attention. So if you haven't been uncomfortable so far, you're bound to be uncomfortable with what I'm about to tell you. How many of you here, just out of curiosity, have heard of D.D. Hume, Daniel Douglas Hume? Okay, apart from students in my former classes. Okay. We have lots of pictures of Hume. He was photogenic. He liked dogs. There are several reasons why this case is important. Hume was a spiritist or spiritualist medium during the heyday of mediumship between roughly 1850 and 1930. The case is important because, first of all, Hume was never caught cheating, and his career as a medium lasted almost a quarter of a century. He would conduct seances at the spur of the moment in places he never visited before, so you can't claim that in those cases Hume had a chance to conceal an apparatus or plant a confederate, something like that. That line of argument is completely ruled out. The phenomena are also extremely difficult to explain away for several reasons. One of them is that investigators could examine the room and the phenomena very carefully while they occurred. And the experiments are often very well controlled. I'll give you an example shortly. Also, some of the phenomena are beyond even today's technology. I'll give you an example of that shortly, which I'm sure you won't believe. He had a very extensive and interesting repertoire of phenomena, so let me just list the major ones. First of all, there was the movement and complete levitation of large objects, including tables, sometimes with several people on top. Sometimes the tables would just glide around the room. People couldn't stop them. He could levitate pianos. And when tables moved or when they tilted sharply, objects on the table would remain in place. Sometimes the objects would alternately move or remain still, depending on what sitters at the seances requested. So they'd say, all right, make the objects move, and then they'd move. And they'd say, make the objects stop, and the objects would stop. Also, on command, objects would become heavier or lighter. This was tested very carefully and cleverly by placing objects on a spring balance. And the experimenter would say to Hume, all right, make the object heavier, and then the spring balance would clearly register that the object was heavier. The experimenter would say, all right, make it lighter, and the object would clearly be lighter. Sitters at seances would also feel various pulls or pinches or other kinds of touches, and that was even when the hands of the medium and the sitters were all visible above the table. There was also something called the earthquake effect. This was when the entire room and all the objects in it would shake violently, even though people outside the room or outside the building would report nothing strange going on. Here's the one I think you're going to have most trouble with. Many people independently reported the production of supple, solid, warm, and mobile materialized hands. These would end at the wrist. They would be of different sizes and shapes. They would carry objects around. They would shake hands with people. People could poke holes into them. The holes would fill up, and then they would dissolve in people's grasp. Now, this is from quite a few independent accounts in decent lighting. Assuming it's genuine, we don't have the technology for that today. Hume could also handle hot coals. Often the rooms would be lit by a coal fire, and Hume would frequently take that hot coal from the fire and transfer his own incombustibility or resistance to pain to other people. So sometimes he would handle the hot coal. Sometimes he'd place the hot coal on the head of somebody sitting around the table. The person wouldn't feel anything except maybe slight warmth. Then he'd take the coal off the person's head, place it on a piece of paper. The paper would burst into flame. Musical instruments would also play, sometimes untouched. There are reports that an accordion that Hume had would play melodies on request floating around the room untouched. And sometimes just while they were handled in such a way as to prevent a musical performance. So the accordion could be held by a handle away from the keys, and it would still play. And then there were lots of knocking sounds or rapping sounds, lights, voices, music, and odors appearing throughout the seance room. And another interesting feature of Hume's case is that often many of these things would be going on all at the same time. So once at a conference, James the Amazing Randi said, "I'm going to write a book and explain how Hume did his trick." It was a stupid thing to say. I mean, there is no one trick. I mean, often all these things would be going on at once. And by the way, Randi never did it. So let me tell you about what I think is one of the most interesting experiments conducted in the history of parapsychology. One of Hume's investigators was the chemist and physicist William Crookes, discoverer of thallium, the inventor of the Crookes tube, which was a precursor to the CRT screens in old-fashioned TVs. Crookes was neutral about the existence of psychic functioning. Initially, when he got into it, he did it because he felt if this was real, it would be important to know, and he was curious. And he also knew that it was important to take at least a careful experimental approach to this. But one of the funny things is, as far as Hume's accordion phenomena were concerned, Hume claimed that the phenomena were strongest under the seance table. Now, I understand that sounds a little suspicious if you just look at it very casually. And Crookes reasoned, well, if that's what Hume believes, he might have a naive belief about the way all this stuff works. I mean, he wasn't a scientist. So Crookes reasoned that the best thing to do under the circumstances is to respect Hume's apparent belief system and not force him out of his psychological comfort zone, to find some way of testing the phenomena under the seance table in as careful a way as possible. So here's what he did. First of all, he bought a new accordion. Okay? So nobody could claim that the accordion in this case was a prop that Hume had somehow rigged up in advance. Secondly, he went to Hume's apartment, watched him change clothes so he could make sure that Hume wasn't concealing some kind of device on his body that would have made the accordion play melodies on request. Although I have to remind you, this was 1871, so it's not clear what kind of device that could possibly have been. Then he took Hume to his house where he had constructed a cage made out of wire and wood. It just fit under his dining room table, and there was room for Hume to get his hand in under the tabletop so he could hold the accordion at the end away from the keys, but there wasn't enough room for him to get his hand all the way into the cage so he could manipulate the keys of the accordion. There were 9 observers present, all members of the Royal Society. 2 were stationed on either side of Hume to make sure that he wasn't taking his feet out of his boots to do something, although it's not clear how he could have gotten them into the cage. There was another observer stationed under the table with a lamp. Under those conditions, the accordion was seen to move in and out, the keys were depressed, sounds came out of the accordion. Then Crookes told Hume to take his hand out of the cage, put both hands on the table. He ran an electric current through the cage. And under those conditions, the accordion was still seen to flop around inside the cage. Now, I happen to think that's one of the strongest experiments conducted in the history of parapsychology. No magician has ever tried to duplicate that under conditions similar to those imposed on Hume, and I think for good reason. Now, this I want to show you just because it's too cool not to. Various kinds of phenomena have been going on in seances for a long time after the heyday of the spiritualist movement. I want to show you some from the mid-40s. There was a Danish photographer named Sven Turk who he worked with a guy who seemed to have mediumistic abilities, and they conducted a lot of seances in the dark where they got apparently very dramatic object levitations. And they used, I think, a very sound and interesting technique. It's sort of standard for seances conducted in the dark. And what he did was, I'm going to come around here. You see these white things here and on the heads? You can sort of see it on the heads, but around the chair legs are strips of luminescent tape. All these would be charged before the lights were turned off. So Turk had an array of cameras set to go when he triggered his cable release, which he's holding there in his hand. So you could see from the luminescent strips when any object that had the luminescent strips on them would start to move. And at that point, he would trigger the cameras, and they got various kinds of interesting results. So I want to show you a bunch of these. Now here you see the people have luminescent strips on their heads too, so that allowed them in darkness to see where everybody was. And Turk also had several cameras set up at the same time, so he got some of these shots from different angles. That's from another angle. So you see the luminescent strips on the feet of the table, on the wrists, and the heads of the participants. That's the same one as the last, from a different angle. Same one. Okay, that brings me to Ted Serios. The phenomenon of Ted Serios represents one of two main classes of so-called psychic photography. The first is spirit photography, and these are cases where photographs ostensibly show images of deceased individuals. This was big business during the heyday of spiritualism, and many people believe, probably correctly, that most of the results obtained during that period were fraudulent. And then there's what Ted did, which is often called thoughtography. All right, so there's thoughtography, which is presumably a case of psychokinesis. Presumably it's a case of some subject causing an image to appear on film or a photographic plate, as the case may be. The term was actually coined early in the 20th century by a Japanese psychologist, Fukurai. He conducted some very interesting experiments, and despite the fact that they were, I think, pretty clean, he was driven out of his university. So things haven't changed a whole lot. There wasn't a whole lot of activity after Fukurai in conducting experiments in thoughtography. And one of the reasons many people suspected that because of photography's reliance on darkroom procedures, fraud was very likely the best explanation of the phenomena. So there wasn't a whole lot of research in thoughtography until Ted Serios appeared. And the reason this made a difference was that Ted's photographs appeared using what was at the time the newly invented Polaroid system of instant photography. And so people could watch as the film was unsealed. They could watch as it was inserted into the camera. This was fresh film. They could watch as the film was removed and then as images developed and appeared. There was no darkroom. So everything was happening right before their eyes. A number of people investigated Ted, but Ted's principal investigator was Jule Eisenbud, and Jule worked intensively with Ted for 3 years, from May of '64 to June of '67. And during that time, he conducted thousands of trials, witnessed by at least 100 different observers, mostly scientists, but also some experienced magicians. And those trials yielded approximately 1,000 anomalous Polaroid images. All of them, as you now know, residing here at UMBC, and many of them beautifully displayed here in the gallery. More than 400 of the photos contained specific images. These were usually distorted or blurry images of buildings, but sometimes of other things. And some of these images were attempts by Ted to reproduce sealed target images. So there would be images contained in opaque sealed envelopes, and Eisenbud or others would ask Ted to try to produce a Polaroid of what was in the target. And some of those trials were judged to be successful, although most of the correspondences weren't very close. That doesn't mean that they're any less remarkable just because images appeared when they shouldn't have. Ted also produced blackies, these are photographs that were apparently not exposed at all, even though light wasn't prevented from reaching the film. They shouldn't have been completely dark or completely underexposed. And he produced whiteys. These were apparently severely overexposed, even though in those cases all visible light sources had been blocked from the camera lens. Now, as you read some of the material here in the gallery, you'll notice references to the distortion in Ted's images. And these are significant kinds of distortions. And one of the reasons is that they frustrate appeals to prior fraudulent preparation of the images, for reasons I think will become clear, and also improvised manipulation of undistorted images. So one of them that you see, I forget now where it is, I think it's on that wall. There's a well-known photo Ted took or produced of Eisenbud's ranch house and barn, which were adjacent to one another. And what's interesting about this is that the image that Ted produced more closely resembled Eisenbud's ranch at a period before Ted had ever seen it. And parts of the barn were depicted in a condition in which it had never existed. So the distortions had no real business being there. So I invite you to study what's on the wall in greater depth later, but you can see that in the bottom here, things are happening on the bottom of the barn, which represented the barn in a state it had never actually been in, and quite different from what you see up there. So those are the kinds of distortions that Ted tended to produce, and I think quite convincingly frustrate appeals to a manipulation of images of one kind or another. But the best way to convince yourself of that is to really look at some of the pictures around here. Now, this is a problematic case for a couple of reasons. And many people are very skeptical about the Serios case. I think it's easy to put the lid on that, so I want to talk about this for a little bit. One problem was that Ted was an alcoholic. He was a flaming alcoholic. And he preferred to work while he was heavily intoxicated. So as the sessions progressed, Ted would become increasingly difficult to control. And so many skeptics argue that as he became more difficult to control, then it was possible for Ted to engage in various kinds of fraudulent practices that would have escaped the attention of even wary observers. Also, Ted liked to use what he called a gizmo placed in front of the camera lens. Now, the gizmo was usually just a rolled piece of black cardboard that came with packages of Polaroid film. It seemed to be just a kind of device that Ted liked to use. It helped him to concentrate or focus, if you want. And it was just a kind of psychological crutch, as far as I can tell. But a lot of people thought that the gizmo was the secret to Ted's being able to fraudulently produce images, because skeptics alleged that Ted could conceal transparencies or pictures in the gizmo, and so when he held the gizmo up to the camera lens, the camera would be recording the image concealed in the gizmo. The principal source of this gizmo hypothesis was an article published in Popular Photography in October of 1967. And Eisenbud responded in the following November issue. He offered a challenge to anyone to duplicate the phenomena under conditions similar to those actually imposed on Ted, but no one ever accepted Eisenbud's challenge. In any case, the gizmo hypothesis is extremely lame. And it would quickly morphed into the unverified claim that Serios phenomena had been duplicated by James the Amazing Randi. And many people have, to this day, accepted that. It's a complete falsehood. They've accepted it as an established fact. To give you an example, the noted science writer Martin Gardner claimed this in a couple places. In the journal Nature, he wrote that Randi demonstrates the Serios phenomena regularly and with more skill. It's a complete fabrication. Randi has never even attempted to duplicate the Serios phenomena under conditions in which Serios did it himself. Randi is such a publicity hound that if he had actually succeeded at that, everybody would know about it. Randi hasn't even tried. So let's be specific. What's wrong with the gizmo hypothesis? It is so lame, it's almost comical, except that people seem to accept it. First of all, Ted often produced multiple images in one experimental session. And that just raises the probability of detection of fraud, because he would have had to very quickly replace transparencies, images in the gizmo. Jule's son Rick reminded me yesterday that often several people would hold their own Polaroid cameras. Ted would go from one to the other. He'd produce a picture on this one, and then this one, and then this one. So if all those images were being produced by Ted putting different images in the gizmo, he would have had to very quickly take one out, put another one in, take one out, put another one in, without being detected. To me, that's incredible. Also, as if that weren't enough, the gizmo was usually examined before, during, and after shooting, and no images or other devices were ever found inside. And experimenters often held the gizmo until the photo was taken. They just gave it to Ted right before the photo. But there are even better reasons. First of all, Ted sometimes produced images under conditions of complete darkness, and also sometimes on unexposed, still opaquely wrapped film. It wasn't even done by triggering the camera. And this is the kind of thing that critics ignore, and along with other test conditions where the appeal to hidden devices would appear really ludicrous. But let me give you some good examples. For one thing, Serios produced more than 36 images when he was separated from the camera at distances of 1 to 66 feet. So here's why that's a problem. For the hidden image in the gizmo hypothesis to have any credibility, Serios would have needed to place the gizmo no more than a small fraction of an inch from the camera lens. Otherwise, the camera would take a picture of the gizmo, not the image allegedly hidden in it. Think about this. This is just a small piece of black paper. It's about like this. So he held it up to the camera lens. So the only way the camera lens on a Polaroid would get the picture of the image, if there was one inside the gizmo, would be if it was held right against the lens. If he backs up from it, you're going to get a picture of the gizmo, or just some sort of blurry image, not a picture of the image inside. And Ted was sometimes separated from the camera by being placed inside an electrically shielded Faraday cage, while the camera was held by the experimenter outside the cage, obviously well beyond the range needed for the gizmo trick to work. And, as if that weren't enough, in some of those trials, Ted was dressed in clothes provided by the experimenter, which, of course, eliminates the presumed hiding place for images to be later inserted inside the gizmo. And also, the hidden image in the gizmo hypothesis doesn't account for Ted's ability to produce blackies and whiteys. So after June 67, Ted could no longer produce identifiable images on film. There was an interesting moment where Ted produced a picture of curtains. And Eisenbud realized that Ted was signaling that his period of being able to do this was over. That's the old image of fini, the image of curtains. It was curtains. So the curtain came down on Ted's ability to produce identifiable images on Polaroid film, although he continued to be able to produce blackies and whiteys and some other anomalous effects on film. Now, I've actually worked with Ted on a couple of occasions. I've observed him producing anomalous photos on two different occasions, one in 1999 with Jule, and another an experiment informally conducted by Rick Eisenbud and myself. If you want to read about that, this is the sleazy promotional part of the program. You'll have to read my chapter on Ted Serios in The Gold Leaf Lady. If you want to know more about the case of Hume and other astounding cases of physical mediumship, you can read some of it in there. Also a book of mine called The Limits of Influence. And of course, if you want to read about Serios. There are two editions of The World of Ted Serios. This is the first. I convinced Jule at some point to write a second edition because the first edition sold very briskly until the Popular Photography article appeared, and then everybody bought into the gizmo hypothesis, and hundreds of copies, if not more, were returned to the publisher. And Jule was pretty discouraged at that point. But eventually, I convinced him to write a second edition in which he added a number of things, including a reply to all the skeptics. So I encourage you to look at each, because there's good stuff contained in the first edition which is not in the second, and there's valuable new material contained in the second edition. If you want to find out more about my work in this area, I have a university website, but you'll never remember the URL unless you're a URL savant. So fortunately, I have a whimsical second website with a name that's a whole lot easier to remember, and you'll find links there to my UMBC website. So I don't know if we have time for discussion, but I'm happy to take questions if we do.
One moment. Okay. We'll have questions in just a moment, but we have a very special guest here this evening, and that's Dr. Rick Eisenbud. And I've asked Rick if he would say a few words for just a moment, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Tom. We're all delighted that there was this much interest generated for the seats to be filled up. I think there was some worry that there would only be, us and maybe a few people sitting in the front row. But I was thinking that I was originally going to speak before Steve got up, and so between Steve and the dean, almost everything has been said that I was going to say. So I'll just try to do this a little bit more impromptu. But I want to say that it's been said, my father was a psychiatrist, but he had this outside interest in psychic phenomena since he was, a very young man. But for years and years, before Ted came along, he was just trying to duplicate variations of the J.B. Rhine experiments at Duke. And when I was just a little type, maybe 8 years old or 9 years old, I remember doing an experiment with him one day. I actually produced results that were consistently worse than chance. And then delighted my father. He thought that was absolutely fantastic. Needless to say, I don't spend much time going to Las Vegas because I don't usually have very good luck. But I had to witness the humility that my father had to endure, for years and years as he was kind of rejected by his colleagues in psychiatry and psychoanalysis. And I remember his describing a scene where after he met Serios and saw that he could do what he did, he thought he might just go to the University of Colorado, where he was on the faculty, and speak to some of his colleagues to see if they could get some funding to do some real good experiments. And during that presentation with people that were his colleagues and his friends, one guy was the head of the Department of Biophysics and was a candidate for a Nobel Prize in genetics. And a few of those guys simply got up in the middle of his presentation and walked out. That they were so insulted that he would even bring up the idea that that they would have funding for something as way out as psychic phenomena. But I just remember, when my father went to Chicago to see the first presentation of Ted Serios, and just how completely dumbfounded he was. And that's when he came back to Denver and told me about that incident. But Ted actually lived at our house for about a year when, in order for my father to study him, and it was a tremendous imposition on our family, needless to say, to have this character who was drunk much of the time, carousing around our house and coming in at all times, during the night after whatever he was doing. But just, I got to know Ted then, but I got to know him even better after my father passed away. I sort of had to take over the management of him. He wasn't quite as wild when he was in his 80s. He still did drink quite a bit. But I knew him well enough during the time that these experiments were going on in the late 60s that I simply thought that the idea that there might be some fraudulent behavior was ridiculous, knowing this person who really couldn't manage even his own affairs very well, let alone rig some sort of a very, sophisticated mechanism by which he could have produced these photographs, irrespective of the fact that they were very, very well observed, sessions with, people who were at the University of Colorado, that were on the faculty, even the dean of the university. One night, Ted came out with some pretty interesting photographs. But I want to say that, after he published the book and the sales kind of dipped when this popular photography article came out, there were 25 or 30 years that my father basically would answer correspondence about this, but there was no real interest to any great extent. There was, under the radar, there was sort of a following in the United States and around the world. But it sort of died down, and he sort of lived with that and just went on with his life. But I want to say that there's somebody in the audience that has come tonight who is a longtime family friend since I was a little boy. He was my brother's friend, and he would hang around the house from time to time. And Harris Sherman saw some very unusual phenomena at the Eisenbud house, as I believe, because I wasn't there. He saw a table that was, they were having a bit of a seance, and there was a table that apparently people had their fingers on, and the table ascended the stairs to the second floor of our house, with people just lightly touching the table. I don't know whether that's a perfect description, but it's probably something like that. But mentioning Harris is also relevant because his daughter, when she was just in grade school, did an experiment, did a project on Ted Serios, and came over, and my father was absolutely delighted to be able to see that there was somebody from the younger generation that was interested in this, and was just thrilled to be able to help Harris's daughter with this project. And apparently they tried to get they got Ted Serios on the telephone and tried to get some sort of a photograph at a distance because he was in Chicago and they were in Denver. Nothing really came of that. But that was probably the most excited I'd seen my father in years and years, that there was still this amount of interest in the younger generation. Anyway, I want to say that I'm immensely grateful to Steve and Tom Beck for making the archive here at Special Collections possible. And I think this is just a beautiful exhibit. My father would have been absolutely thrilled to see this, and in addition to just having a certain legitimacy of having the backing of a major university, which he never was able to see during his lifetime. I also want to say something about Steve Braude. I met Steve 30 years ago when he first came to Denver to talk with my father, but then they would have these marathon discussions that would last, 6, 8 hours, several days in a row, and they would talk about everything about, psi phenomenon to all aspects of philosophy and the meaning of life, and they could talk about, they could be talking about Einstein and Freud and Margaret Mead and Shakespeare with a little bit of Descartes and Wittgenstein thrown in, and nobody even tried to follow what they were talking about. But that's when I got to know Steve, and Steve has been a very close family friend ever since. And I just want to salute Steve's work. I don't have to go through exactly what his bona fides are, but as this tenure has it, the university is coming to an end, I would say that for Steve, it also presents an opportunity for many more contributions to the humanities and our understanding of the universe.
Thank you, Rick. So I guess we have time for some questions, so knock yourselves out. Yeah.
How did Ted Serios, or did he, talk about his process from his perspective? You know, what, did he, I mean, as a maker of images myself, as you know, right, a large part of that for me starts with intent. What is the intent? Did he conjure that kind of, did he talk about it in those terms? Or
He
did
wasn't a very reflective person.
Did anyone, was there any indication of what he did to get in the proper mood or frame of mind to produce these? Or?
Look, part of the problem with Ted is a couple things. First of all, mostly he was interested in getting another drink, finding his next sexual partner, and basically he couldn't be trusted. So you could never trust what Ted told you. So even if he said something about himself, you couldn't be sure.
You
So,
couldn't be sure.
right.
So how did they get him to do, I mean, how would you get him to the situation where he would produce an image?
Well, he discovered he was experimenting with hypnosis at one point in the 50s, I think, or before, and he discovered he could do this. And I mean, Ted was not stupid. He recognized that he had something that nobody else did, so he had something that was marketable and people were interested in. And he liked getting the attention that he got. So he certainly enjoyed the attention. That's about as deep as it went. Yes?
Two questions in one. One, did any RSPK occur around Ted? And two, did anybody ever document his level of lubrication to how many images he could produce? Was that documented?
RSPK means recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. It's a kind of shorthand for like poltergeist-like phenomena. I'm not aware that there are any other physical effects happening in the vicinity while Ted was doing his thing. I'd have to think about that. And Rick, can you think of? Yeah, I don't recall that any clear correlations were ever made between Ted's degree of lubrication and what he could do. It was pretty hard to measure Ted's degree of lubrication because you never really knew what his starting point was. I mean, you couldn't be observing him all the time, first of all, to see how long he'd been drinking before you started to check him out. And there's really no way to measure. Yes?
I wanted to ask a question. You presented this as a human phenomenon, and I wonder whether I might not ask in behalf of atheists, whether this doesn't open the possibility that there is, in fact, perhaps unfortunately, a God.
Oh, look, the evidence for psychic functioning and for psychokinesis opens up a monstrous, a Pandora's box of opportunities for things. Look, one of the reasons both Rick and I have alluded to the resistance people feel to psychic functioning. And clearly what bothers some people about psychic functioning is the spiritual implications of it for some. There's another thing that I think is even more intimidating to a lot of people, and it's one of the reasons I think I and others who take this stuff seriously have experienced such hostility. Think about it this way. If I can move, say, a matchstick a millimeter by thought alone, it's a very small step conceptually from doing that to making somebody drop dead by thought alone. So the existence of any PK at all forces us to take seriously, I think, a kind of magical worldview that most of us associate, usually condescendingly, only with so-called primitive cultures. It's a worldview where thoughts can kill or have other sorts of unwelcome consequences. And it's a worldview where you might have to take seriously things like hexing or the evil eye, and in which we might have to take responsibility in principle for a whole range of things most of us would just as soon be bystanders for. So I think the very existence of any PK or the possibility of PK is extremely intimidating. And another can of worms that opens, look, if this can happen, if these things can happen, if PK can happen, it's not going to happen just for parapsychologists. It's not going to happen just when parapsychologists set out to look for it. And if it can be linked with human intent, especially unconscious intent, then for all we know, unconscious PK could have been mudding up the experimental waters throughout the history of science. And I think these are among the possibilities that a lot of people just don't want to take seriously. And I think they contribute to the hostility that often gets directed toward people like myself. Peter.
And I think also in the religious community, a lot of people, especially, well, I don't want to step on any toes or anything, but especially more fundamentally oriented Christians, they have a knee-jerk rejection of this because they immediately equate it and many other paranormal phenomena with Satan, demonism. So the reason why this stuff is working is because of Satan. Satan is playing a role here, and a lot of that frightens a lot of people.
I've never fully understood that because, I mean, if you take the Bible as seriously as the fundamentalists do, many of Christ's miracles would have counted as instances of PK.
Well, I don't disagree with you, but it's a criticism I've heard many times.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yes.
I just wondered if people in your field have worked in conjunction with physicists at all.
All the time. There are a lot of physicists working within parapsychology. Interestingly enough, I have found physicists more open, probably because of the strangeness of much of what goes on in their own field, to psychic functioning than scientists in the behavioral sciences.
Is there a name for that discipline, the combination?
No. I mean, everybody in parapsychology, at least the people who are members of the Parapsychological Association, which is an affiliate of the AAAS, they all come from some branch of orthodox sciences or the humanities. So we have physicists, biologists, psychologists, chemists, the occasional odd philosopher, very odd philosopher. Yes?
Could you say a little bit about the implications of time in these images? Because from what I gather, some of Serios' images suggest that buildings in previous states of repair in which he wouldn't have been able to see them.
Yes, well, for example, the image of Eisenbud's ranch and barn, I'm not sure that time is so much involved. I mean, it may just accidentally correspond to the way the buildings looked at a previous point in time, but also the buildings had features that they never had at any point in time. So if these are projections, whatever that means exactly, from Serios' mind, Eisenbud, as a psychiatrist, was interested in the depth psychological analysis of this. You know, what was this telling us about what's going on in Serios' head? He had a variety of conjectures about that, but so I'm not sure what happened in the Serios photos is particularly relevant to our understanding of the way time works. It would be more interesting if Serios could have, for example, gotten images of targets that would be selected randomly in the future, but that wasn't something that happened. So where it would have looked precognitive. Yes?
What led Ted to alcoholism?
I'm sorry? Okay.
What led Ted to alcoholism?
Boy, I don't really know the answer to that. Yes?
Just kind of piggyback on that. Was Ted's, consumption of alcohol a precursor for the state of mind in which he had to get himself into in order to perform what he did?
I don't know that he thought he needed to do that. I mean, he just liked to drink. When Rick and I conducted our informal experiment with Ted a number of years ago, Ted claimed to have been sober for 4 years. I'm not sure if that was an exaggeration, but it was clear he was sober on that occasion. And he was curious on that occasion to see if he could produce something while he was sober, and we got some interesting anomalous results. Yes?
Do you have any opinion or idea as to why his ability seemed to just stop?
None. And I don't think Jule understood that either. But I will say this. I mean, one of the most robust effects in parapsychology is the so-called decline effect, where even the greatest psychic superstars seem to have periods where they produce very florid phenomena and then it seems to drop off. It's probably the most replicable effect in parapsychology. And so Ted had an arc to his career too. And I think there are parallels to what happens in the career of many other kinds of people, in athletic careers and musical careers and academic careers, needless to say too. Periods of great productivity and then, yes, Charlie.
What does this, what do you think Ted Serios' abilities say about humanities' latent abilities in general? The latent abilities of just other people to do these sort of so-called, extraordinary fields?
I'd say it's one of the big unanswered questions in parapsychology, whether psychic functioning or psychic capacities or abilities are things of which we're all capable of, or whether, there are two main options. One is that they're unevenly distributed amongst human beings like athletic and musical abilities. Another possibility is that psychic functioning is something we're all doing more or less unconsciously and involuntarily all the time, and what distinguishes the superstars from the others is similar to what distinguishes, say, yogis from regular people. Yogis, for example, can do all sorts of remarkable things with bodily functions that are ordinarily involuntary, like making one half of the hand hot and the other half cold. So what they have is a kind of meta ability, the ability to harness and control functioning which is ordinarily involuntary. And I'd say there's no evidence that leads us in one direction or the other at this point. It's not clear what it would be either. Yes, in the back. Fight amongst yourselves.
Has there been any kind of correlation or work with those who've done remote viewing? Because it seems that when a target is emotionally charged, his drawings will appear. They could be in the future or something, but it's when that's more attached to what appears in the image.
Right. The issues of time come up in connection with effects that seem to be causally connected to things that have not yet happened. So there could be cases of ostensible precognition, or the sorts of effects that Darrell Bem has recently been describing in his paper. So-called presentiment effects, where people are having physiological responses to stimuli that haven't yet been randomly chosen. That's a huge topic. There are alternate ways to describe that, as opposed to saying that some future event is causing an earlier event. But that's a whole different talk. So I'd be happy to talk to you about it later. Yeah.
What do you think about quantum physics and parapsychology, and how basically the quantum physicists are looking at parapsychology now and saying, oh wow, you guys, what is this phenomenon? It really relates to quantum entanglement, etc. I had a brief talk with Lloyd Auerbach about it.
The community of physicists, I'd say, divides, I don't know whether evenly or not, among people who think that if the phenomena are real, then some extension of current physics ought to be able to accommodate them, and they're looking for ways to do that. So there are some physicists working within parapsychology who are following that particular path. Others think we need something a bit more radical, and so they're trying to pin their hopes on some of the current developments in physics. Yes, sir.
Was there any thought about creating electromagnetic disturbances? I guess this is a thought I had. Some people, when they wear watches, the watches run been any thought or hypothesis around Ted having some slightly odd electromagnetic internal disturbance like that that might be causing the change on the film?
I'm not aware that anything like that was ever consistently observed. It's true that there are some people who seem to have a disastrous effect on electronic or other items in their vicinity. That would be one kind of presumably unconscious PK if that's what's occurring. So it's a frequently observed effect, but I'm not aware that it was observed in Ted's case. I know that I'm happy to take questions, but I also know that Tom would like folks to enjoy the refreshments and the exhibit. So I'll take one more, and then we'll do that. I saw, yeah.
I'm just wondering, it's about the thing about the subject earlier about remote viewing. I was wondering if have remote viewers use photography the similar way that Ted Serios has to produce their images?
Well, remote viewers don't produce images. I mean, remote viewers might describe some target location, for example, that may not have yet been selected.
But had they ever used photography the same way that Ted Serios has?
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, Ted's case is, as far as I know, completely unique. It's not the only case of apparent photography, but the only one using Polaroid images, which at least gets around one standard objection to this kind of phenomenon. Well, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your time.